Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well. Have I got a bonus upload for you? You will enjoy this one. Before we get into it, a couple links. As you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support this channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It doesn't cost you a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because these things really do help this channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, folks, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to tonight's bonus, shall we? Today's first experience on the paranormal side. I guess I'll dive right into what happened and not bore you with any unimportant details. I was hiking on a trail I'm very familiar with, and because of changes in the weather, I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods. I wanted to get to my car before a downpour, and I knew the area like the back of my hand. Before I knew it, I felt very strange, disoriented, and nothing looked familiar. I'm not sure if the woods seemed silent before or after I felt this way, but I became undeniably aware of how silent everything was. Oppressingly, downright suffocating silence. And my heart began to pound as I stood in place, and it felt as if the woods were spinning and closing in around me, like I had stepped into something I could not comprehend. It was then I noticed something about 15 feet in front of me. It was 10 feet high and about 8 feet wide, and a distortion. It was like something was bending the light and moving toward me like a fogged up mirror. Almost, but with no definite shape. But it was moving with purpose and intelligence, and would be completely unnoticeable if not for the distortion within and me directly looking at it. I turned to run and realized another was behind me, the same size and shapeless almost. It was then I realized there was at least 4 of these things closing in on me, and I was trapped. What I was seeing, my brain could not make sense of. I was in utter panic and shock, backed up against a tree because I was terrified to run in the direction of these things. I curled up in a fetal position and put my hands over my ears, because they had began ringing and the sound was deafening. I closed my eyes as these intelligent, cloaked things were all around me, about 5 feet from me. I saw a white flash, like what happens if you were ever hit hard in the head, or fell or punched. That's the best way I can describe it. My ears were ringing and the flash, and then nothing. I woke up to rain falling on me and hours had passed. Everything was normal and I knew where I was. I gathered myself, checked for injuries, and realized I was completely fine. And shakingly, I left the woods and drove home. I cannot make sense of what happened. I have Googled similar events but found nothing quite like what happened to me. And I need answers. I stumbled across stealth cloaking technologies used by the military, and the technology is primitive compared to what I had witnessed, or what these beings or things were, if it was technology, or a living thing. I just don't know. I didn't have answers, and I don't know what happened to me or why. One last thing, this happened in Ireland, and I was in the Midlands. I'd rather not be too specific. Headaches and blurry vision have only been an issue since after the incident. I never had migraines before. They had no definitive shape of the things or beings, but they were huge and moving with purpose and intelligence. I could smell something, which I thought was my brain frying from how loud the sound was, and I know it sounds insane, but I had to cover my ears and crouch down with my head between my knees in an almost fetal position out of fear from the sound and panic just before I had blacked out. When I closed my eyes and could see they were less than 5 feet from me, I could smell a sulfur metallic type smell. Then the flash occurred that was blinding, and I woke up 4 hours later. I was considerably dry, even though it had been drizzling when this occurred. And when I woke, I realized 4 hours had passed. It was raining heavily, but I was pretty much dry. I can't explain it. But there has to be a reason for it all. I won't lie, I'm shook up and a little freaked out, but I'm a rational young man, and I will not jump to any conclusions without sound evidence of proof. It was in an area impossible for me to get lost in. A child, maybe, but not an adult. And at one moment, I felt like I was completely lost in a place I did not recognize whatsoever. And that makes no sense to me at all, because when I awoke, I knew exactly where I was. The only issue with my health is I was diagnosed with autism at a young age, but I am very low on the spectrum, and I live a fully functional, happy life, and it in no way affects me negatively, apart from struggling socially at times, hence why I love nature and the outdoors so much. Today's second experience on the paranormal side. I'm an ordinary man who didn't believe in ghosts or paranormal stuff. I have never thought that one day I'd be on a date with something that made me reconsider my whole belief system. First off, I'm a military officer in a big Middle Eastern country, and due to the sensitivity of my job nature, I can't go into specific details about the story I'm going to tell. We had our orders to camp in a specific spot within the desert and wait to execute our designated mission. The first couple of days went by and everything seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Then we began to notice a strange man walking on nearby hills wearing what looked to be women's clothes. He was walking steadily as if he was looking for something specific. The first time we saw him, we thought he may be one of the locals or nomads, and didn't think much of it, but I sent 2 soldiers away to bring him down to me for questioning, and warn him to keep his distance as it's considered a military area now. But he managed to disappear and vanish every time before anyone could get near him. It became like habit seeing this weird person, and we sort of got used to watching him every day. Finally, when our mission was about to finish, and we were getting ready to pack up our gear and leave, it was on a Wednesday, February 10th, 2010. I was in my tent trying to get some sleep when I heard the sounds of gunshots coming from outside. I quickly pulled my gun and ran out of the tent to find one of the soldiers shouting that we had got him. "We finally got him, sir." I asked him nervously who, but deep down I knew who he was talking about. He said the strange man we see every day. We saw him coming down from the hills, running towards us as if he was floating above the ground, so we shot him twice in the chest. I don't know why, but I had these overwhelming feelings like something bad was about to happen. Reluctantly, I asked him to show me the body. Once we got there, I swear that we both heard the sound of the man laughing loudly and giggling. When I looked at the dead body, it was a man in the mid-30s wearing a white woman lingerie and having a strange necklace with a odd symbol around his neck. His face was looking directly at me, smiling as if he knew how I felt and what I was thinking. Honestly, I was freaking out myself, but I did not show it. I had a gut feeling that we had made a huge mistake killing this being, It was downtime, the sun was about to rise, so I told my men to carry the body and burn it. When they finished, one of the soldiers wrote a Quranic verse on a stone, which said, "O satisfied soul, return to your Lord, well-pleased, well-pleasing. Join my devotees and enter my heaven," and placed it on top of the tomb. When we all gathered around the grave to recite some Quran in order to ease his soul, we did not believe our eyes when we saw the hard stone above the grave crack in half, and we all heard an angry roar coming from inside the grave while the dirt around it was shaking heavily. This was it for me. I couldn't take it any longer, so I ordered the soldiers to grab their stuff in a hurry and get out of there. After I got back, I went to this old wise man. I knew him to be a shaman, to tell him about this friggin' incident and find some answers. He asked me to describe the shape of the necklace the man was wearing, but refused to tell me anything further. And all he said was, "You should be thankful that you got out of there safely." To this day, I still have no idea what this man was, or whether it was a jinn or a demon, but I know for sure he was not human. I've heard theories about my incident throughout time, but I don't know if any of it makes any sense. There is no rational explanation for it. Today's third experience on the paranormal side. This was my only first occurrence with shadow people growing up. I've had many more, mostly in my pre-teens to teens. Most of my paranormal experiences occurred within the range of 15 or so years, give or take. My earliest experience began when I was 3 years old or so, and my last profound experience tapered off around 19 years old. The story begins with my first paranormal experience of shadow people. My parents met in the late 80s, and they were both serving members in the military. Shortly after they both met, both my parents were assigned to an Air Force base in Ontario. I was born there, and my brother followed shortly after. Roughly a year after my brother was born, we were transferred to the province of Quebec. We were located in a highly francophone region in Quebec, where my father had been posted to the army base. My parents decided to buy a house in the neighborhood town. It wasn't a luxury home, but I enjoyed my time there as a kid. We had a large backyard, and I spent a lot of time in it. The history of the house is unknown to my family. From the looks of it, the house didn't appear haunted. It wasn't bent out of shape. It was just a 1970s, 80s cookie-cutter house in an ordinary middle-class neighborhood. I suppose this might be one of the many visions of what a basic family home would look like in North America. In this house, at 3 years old, everything started. We were what I thought an average family, happy and in good health. Nobody had any serious issues. The family dynamic was awesome. My dad was incredibly creative and fun. For the most part, we were good children. We did well in our early school years, and we weren't too spoiled, especially because we couldn't afford to be. But my mother did everything she could to pamper me and my brother. She wanted a good life for us. She would save her money to ensure we always had new clothes and shoes for school. She also always taught us good manners, to treat people with respect, and not to judge others. Despite their eventual separation, they remained to be amazing parents. They always did their best to offer us a good life. When we moved to this town, my mother sacrificed her career to follow my dad's. I believe it was a fluke that they were previously posted to the same base, because in the 80s, career managers were not as accommodating to service couples as they are now in Canada. She decided to use this opportunity to raise her children and look after the home until we were old enough to look after ourselves. Now, once you entered the front door of the house, there was a small squared area for removing your shoes and hanging keys. There were 2 sets of stairs directly in front of you. one to the ground floor and one to the basement. Below and directly to the left there was a bathroom, and inside the bathroom on the left-hand side there was a small storage area. The space was large enough to kneel down and walk into, so my dad used the space to develop film, since it was dark and secluded. While the restroom was on the left, my room was on the right, which was besides my parents'. I had a small window in my bedroom on the left side that had a partial view of our large fenced-in backyard. I couldn't see anything though, since the window was located high enough on the wall, and I was almost at basement level, plus I was just a little guy. I vividly recall many details. My parents purchased my first bed for me when we moved into the house. It was lifted up onto a metal frame and painted bright red. There was also a railing that my parents took off later when I became older. It was between the age of 3 and 4, but well before kindergarten, before I experienced something so impactful that I would forever have burned into my head until this day. Most nights, we probably went down for bed at 7, 8 o'clock. We were familiar with the routine, and we followed it. We had a very military-style discipline in our home. Not only were my parents in the military, but so were the previous generations in my family, and that culture carried on. We weren't perfect kids, but I like to think we were well behaved. One night, which looks identical to all the other nights as a child except for Christmas, I awoke in my cherry red bed. I knew it was late because it was dark outside from my window, but not so late that my parents were asleep because I could hear them talking upstairs with the TV on. I struggled to fall asleep, so I lied in my bed, looked around my room like any curious child. I was getting uncomfortable, so I turned over to my left side, which would have been facing the door of my bedroom. It was dark enough in the room, but I was in my room long enough for my eyes to adjust to the darkness at this stage. The only light I had from my room was the gentle backside of a faint porch light, and any ambient light from the moon. If any, I looked around the room, and then I began to draw my attention to my bedroom door. It had passively piqued my interest because I noticed that the area located directly in front of my closed bedroom door was unusually dark. I remembered being able to look at the surrounding walls, but not the specific area for some reason. I kept watching the black mask and looked away a few times, still looking around the room. I looked back at the door and, in the confusion, saw an opaque black figure and an outline of a person standing right there. It was probably about 8 feet away or so, give or take. I wasn't initially scared, and instead I kind of giggled, thinking it looked like a person and that some object in my room was obviously creating a very telling shadow of a humanoid. I kept looking into the shadows, but I started to realize that something seemed strange. The shadow itself was not on the wall. It was off the wall, in the room, standing like a person, and opaque black in color. No light seemed to come through. It was not transparent. It was not translucent. It was deep black hole black. I was still confused, and I didn't put much thought into it, so I kept gazing. In one moment, I was relaxed and intrigued as to what was causing this image in front of me, but in the next, I was struck with a paralyzing fear as I started to see the figure move toward me. It wasn't walking like a human or something I even recognized on the planet at that moment in my life. There were almost no features, there was no face, but I could clearly discern the shape of the body, arms, legs, and so on. He resembled a man. When the shadow approached me, it didn't do so by walking. There were no fluid, human-like limbs moving around in a human-like or any earth-like fashion. The shadow would vanish, then reappear a step or two closer in a moment, as fast as a shutter can trigger on a camera. I didn't stop looking. I could not shout. I trembled, I cried. I had my blanket set against my eyes. I kept watching. As if I was in a film, it continued to move itself toward me, disappearing, reappearing, disappearing, reappearing, until he stood right over me by my nightstand, and I was petrified by that moment. With speed, I threw the blankets over my head and buried my face as deeply into the pillows and blankets as I could without suffocating. It never left. My eyes were closed, but it made no difference. 3 of these shadows were penetrating their way into my mind, even though my eyes were sealed shut. These shadows were morphing vividly into horrifying faces, shapes, and grotesque images, all with the purpose of causing overwhelming fear. I could see them in my head. They were as clear as day. It was almost like they were telling me, "You can't hide from us." I felt them trying to take pleasure in my fear. It was very dark and sinister, and I couldn't get these figures to leave. I felt trapped, like a deer being surrounded by wolves. I could no longer bear it, as I knew I had no place to hide. Somehow I had the courage to dash out of my room and scream for my parents. I remember running up the stairs to the living room, tripping on the way and shouting, "Mommy, Daddy, there's a man in my bedroom." I was emotionally distraught, weeping, trembling, and hyperventilating. My mother did what I think most moms would do and tried to reassure their kid that it was just a dream and to go back to sleep. I insisted on the fact that there was a man in my room. My parents took me back to bed, turned on the light, and said a prayer while leaving a holy crucifix under my pillow. It was the only case I can recall in this specific town, but it was not my last experience. They came back at times later in my life, from the age of 9 to 18, and at a much higher intensity. Today's next experience on the paranormal side. This event took place in 1992. I was a young man in the military. I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas at the time. For those of you who are familiar with Fort Hood, you will know what I'm talking about when I say North Fort Hood. For those of you who are not, let me try to explain so you better understand why we were where we were when this happened. Fort Hood is a very large military base, probably one of the largest military bases by land in the United States. The main base is where you will find all of the buildings, motor pools full of vehicles, and so forth. It's just called Fort Hood. It's on the south end of the overall land that comprises Fort Hood, and just outside its gates is a town of Killeen. Most of Fort Hood is wilderness. That wilderness is a training area for soldiers to go and train in. And there is also a large impact area for artillery units that have to train with their cannons. At the far northern end of the base, there is a small complex called North Fort Hood. It takes about 30 or 40 minutes to drive from the main base up to North Fort Hood. In the early 90s, there was not much in the way of buildings or infrastructure in North Fort Hood. The unit I was assigned to had to calibrate a piece of equipment, and that meant that it had to be set up and left in place for about a week while the calibration took place. I'm not going to get into details about this equipment, and it is not vital to the story anyway. What is important to note is that we had to set this equipment up at Fort Hood during the process. During the day, we had some soldiers who were there working on calibrations, but at night, we obviously were not just going to leave this expensive equipment unguarded. So every evening, we would leave 2 soldiers with the equipment to keep an eye on things and make sure nothing happened to it. It was very easy duty by every measure. There was a tent to stay in and plenty of food. Soldiers who stayed the night to guard the equipment got off the next day. Basically, we'd just sit in the tent playing cards and some other games. We'd keep our eyes on things. It's basically camping, you know? Them bag phones. They were pretty expensive. Needless to say, neither of us had a cell phone. Now you're asking why this is important. Well, we were dropped off for guard duty at around 5 p.m. Everyone left. We had no vehicle, no way to communicate with anyone. We were entirely alone if anything happened, and of course we were not expecting anything to happen. It was, after all, very easy duty. Watch the equipment, play some cards, eat some chow, no problem. We're sitting in the tent when the first wind started to kick up, and I noticed some storm clouds moving from the west. Now, whoever they had set that hex tent up apparently had no interest in doing it properly, because as these winds got worse, the tent was really leaning, as though it might fold up at any moment. Clearly, we were about to get hit with a pretty massive thunderstorm, and anyone who has ever lived in central Texas can tell you that storms there can blow up quickly and be pretty violent. Fortunately for us, there was a deuce-and-a-half truck there with a shelter on the back. For those of you who do not know what a deuce-and-a-half is, it's a large six-wheel drive truck, and if you want to get a better idea of what they look like, Google M35A2 truck. This particular truck has a shelter on the back, and that is where we retreated in order to get out of the path of the approaching storm. Before anyone asks, I should note that we could not drive the truck away from camp, because it was a need for the calibration, and we would not abandon our post. This falls under the first general order, and anyone who has ever been in the Army knows what I mean. So we secure ourselves in the shelter while the storm passes, and it's the typical Texas frog strangler to be sure. Miraculously, the tent didn't blow over, and I was surprised by that. Still, we decided to stay in the back of the truck until dawn, as we had already moved one of our cots inside. We finally laid down at around 10 p.m. and it was very quiet. This is a very remote area, and while we were in the clearing next to the runway, there was no buildings present, and all around this airstrip was just woods. Today there are buildings, and I have recently looked up the location on Google Maps. At any rate, we left the door on the shelter just slightly open for two reasons. Because the shelter had no power running to it, so there was no airflow going through it. Shutting the door would have left us susceptible to the effects of carbon monoxide. We needed fresh air. We also needed to be able to hear what was going outside. We decided to take turns getting some rest, although we had been told that we were allowed to sleep if we wanted. We were still on base, and there was absolutely no reason to expect anything that was going to happen. My friend was on the cot, the door of the shelter, and I was on the floor at the other end. I felt like I had just dozed off when I was shaken violently awake. It was my friend, and as I sat up, he was pulling the door to the shelter closed and trying to put the lock in on it by using the light from his wristwatch. He was obviously very upset and scared. It was the kind of fear that cannot be faked, as if he's trying to prank me. This was primal. I kept asking him what was wrong, and he finally managed to tell me that something had grabbed him by his foot and tried to pull him out of the shelter. My first thought was that he had dozed off and had a nightmare, but he insisted that he had not even started to fall asleep when whatever grabbed him and said, "We'll be back for you," and let go of him. That's when he shook me awake. I wasn't sure if it was a prank or not, but my gut instinct was he was petrified and his hands were shaking as he tried to lock the shelter door, so there must be some truth to it. I told him that we could not leave the door closed because of the carbon monoxide. I was the higher rank, so technically I was in charge. He refused to stay by the door if it was going to be open, even a little bit, so I agreed to switch places with him. I opened the door just a couple of inches and lied down on the cot, still believing he had just had a really bad nightmare. He's on the floor at the other end of the shelter. Within a few minutes, some pretty strange things began to happen. There were scratching sounds on the shelter, scratching on the sides, on the top, and on the front of the cab where the truck was. A few times the door moved ever so slightly, but never opened. Needless to say that by this time I was convinced that something or someone was definitely outside, and both of us were pretty scared. I reached to the end of the cot I was on and pulled out the metal cross member that was used to give it tension. After I felt around under the cot, I found a wooden handle to a pickaxe. In the Army, we call these pioneering tools, but most of you will know as a pickaxe handle without the pickaxe part on the end. This I handed to my friend and instructed that if anyone opened that door to the shelter, we were going to start beating them with our makeshift weapons. And don't stop beating until whoever it is down on the ground and not moving. The scratching on the exterior of the shelter continued intermittently throughout the night. We made no effort to call out to whomever or whatever it was. I think we were both just in fight mode. If anyone had pulled that door to that shelter fully open, I had full intentions of fighting for all it was worth. I am certain my friend felt the same way. Eventually it began to get light outside, and as the sky began to get light, the scratching stopped. We stayed in the shelter for another 40 to 50 minutes until we saw the sun was fully up. At that point, I said that I was going to push the door all the way open, jump off the back of the truck, and if he saw anyone, just start swinging. So I counted 3, flung the door open, and jumped off the truck. When you're 21, you can jump off of a deuce and a half and it doesn't hurt. Now, I would be far more cautious. At any rate, there was nothing, not a soul. We looked all around the truck and the camp, nothing. What I noticed immediately was that while we were leaving boot tracks in the still wet ground, there were no other tracks around the truck at all. I began to look for loose items in the shelter that may account for the scratching sound. Nothing. I don't know whether it was real or if I should feel relieved or what, but let me tell you, I was still on edge. We packed up our gear, and about 30 minutes later, the relief NCO arrived in a Humvee. He wasn't even fully out of the truck when we piled our stuff in and left. He laughingly remarked that we seemed ready to go. We never told him a thing. In fact, we never said anything to anyone in our unit about what happened. We probably should have, but I think we were afraid that we'd be laughed at. At any rate, I get behind the wheel of the Humvee and my friend in the back of the passenger side. I drove down the road and came to a stop at the main highway that we would take back to Fort Hood. At that moment, then came a clear, loud, and distinct clap of thunder. I leaned out the window and looked up, and then I looked back at my friend who was now in the back of the truck. He said something I'll never forget. "There isn't a cloud in the sky, man." I believe I probably set the record for the fastest drive back to Fort Hood in a Humvee that morning. I'm not the only one that believes in this stuff. I think of a lot of this paranormal stuff is just active imaginations or people making it up. But something happened to us that night, and we'll never forget it. It scared us out of our mind. I don't know if I'll ever experience this again, but I do know I never want to experience it again. I also don't know what it was that caused those scratching sounds that one night, or pulled my friend almost out of the deuce and a half. Alright folks, I hope you all enjoyed this bonus upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. Guys, some just very surreal, paranormal, cryptid encounters. I love them all. I hope you did. I really do. Thank you for supporting the channel. Your support is honestly what makes this channel what it is. And it is special because of you guys. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing your experiences, sharing information, sharing theories,
It really does just blow me away, the community that you guys have created here. So thank you. With that being said, please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, our pets, our family, and friends. These creatures are real. They are out there and they are dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions. Never stop searching for answers. And God bless.